Native Instruments Massive is an extremely versatile plugin used by many professional music producers, but admittedly, it can be a bit intimidating to approach if you've never used it before. By the end of this video, hopefully you'll have a better understanding of the interface of this plugin, and overall, learn more about how to use it. Let's get into it. Hello there, my inspirations. My name is Asper, and today I'm going to teach you how to use Native Instruments Massive. If you've been around the channel for a long time, you know that I love to use Massive when I make my music, so I think I'm going to enjoy making this tutorial, because I've been using Massive for a little over 2 years now. So my goal is, by the end of this video, I hope to teach you all about the interface of Massive. Basically explain what everything is that you're looking at here right now, because I understand it can be a little intimidating, and if you're considering buying Massive, or maybe you already have bought it and you're still a little bit unfamiliar with how to use it, I hope to teach you what I know about it so you can use it a little bit better. So let's get into it. Let's learn all about Massive. When you open up Massive, it will look like this. First, let's learn how to save or load presets. If you go to the top here under File, here's where you can either create a new sound, which basically just starts everything from scratch. You can open your presets, which will just take you to your window directory where you can navigate to whatever saved presets you have and open them up. Recent files, things that you've opened up recently. You can save your current preset, which is important if you make a sound that you like and you want to keep it and use it in the future. You can also import KSD sounds, which is more or less just opening a different file type, I believe, or batch converts. I don't really know much about that, I'll be completely honest. You can change some options in if you like, and of course, if you want to learn more about Massive, you can go under here to help and learn more that way. So if I were to go to File, New Sound, I now have Massive's default sound, just the normal preset that it comes with, which sounds like this. Nothing too fancy. If you'd like, you can click this drop-down menu and load up all of the built-in presets that Massive contains. So if I were to click, I don't know, any one of these, Cloud N9 for example, and if I were to play it, there you go, that's what that sounds like, apparently. So, this is nice if you want to have a starting point. I mean, you can just, in theory, load up a preset and then use that. If you want to be a little more creative, you can load up these presets and then you can change everything from here. This lets you have a good foundation, a good starting point that you can work off of. For now, I'm just going to use a new sound so I can properly explain what everything does. Up here in our top left, we have oscillators. These will determine your bass sound. Again, if I were to play the sound that Massive is creating right now, it sounds like this. And what you're hearing is one square saw wave. That's what this SQU-SW1, that's square saw 1, there's multiple versions of them. All you're hearing is that square saw with the highest wavetable position, highest intensity, highest amp, and no effects. That's all you're hearing. Fairly straightforward. If you want to change the type of oscillator you're using, you can just click up here where it says square saw, or you can use these arrows to navigate between different types of wavetables. So you can click here and you can look at all of the kinds they have. They're divided into basic sections. For example, you have VA, you have your basics, you have your analog/electric, digital hybrid, and FX chords. If I were to play the sound that Massive is creating and then sort of switch between these oscillators, you should notice a difference. And so that's the effect that the oscillators take. For now, I'll stick with a square saw because it's fairly basic. Now, we can use up to 3 oscillators. You'll notice that this oscillator is currently on because at the top left of this window, there's a little blue circle. If I were to click this circle, it turns gray. Now, if I were to play the sound that Massive is creating, I get nothing. The answer is silence because I have no oscillators playing. I have no sound being filtered into my Massive plugin, or rather out of, I guess, but whatever. So, clicking that button, blue means on, gray means off, and I can do the same for these other 2 oscillators. You'll see this is oscillator 1, oscillator 2 is currently off, right? If I were to click it, it should be on now. Oscillator 3, also off, it is now on. Now, if I were to play my sound, it sounds roughly the same, and that's because they are all 3 playing the same exact oscillator. For now, I'll turn them off. For each oscillator, you have 3 knobs you can work with. The one on the left, wavetable position. You could think of this as your particular wavetable, so my square saw, as being an audio file, and this wavetable position is sort of scrubbing through it and picking one particular instance. I guess you could maybe think of it as like a frame, grabbing that particular waveform from whatever position you determine and then making the sound from that, if that makes any sense. At least that's my interpretation of it. You also have an intensity knob, which is sort of self-explanatory. It determines how intense that particular sound is. It more or less gives it a brighter feeling the farther right it is, and the opposite for the left. And then you have your amplitude, or amp. This determines the volume of your particular oscillator, where the farthest left is completely silent, and the farthest right is at the fullest volume you can possibly give. Also, every oscillator has the ability to alter your pitch. In order to change this pitch, you can click and drag either here, where you see these two sets of arrows on the left, or on the right after the decimal, you have two sets of arrows. If you click on the right after the decimals and drag up or down, you'll change the pitch by a small amount. Now, these units are in semitones, in case you were curious. So right now, if I were to set this at 0.21, for example, then that is 0.21 semitones higher than the bass, which is a good way to make a nice detuned sound. So I'm going to turn these off. I'm going to play my sound and just sort of roll up my pitch. Now, if I were to click and drag on the left before the decimal point, this would change my pitch. This changes the ones digit place in my pitch. So it's a way to up it or down it faster. So if I were to click and drag like this, you see that it goes a lot faster. I can also click and drag down. One nifty little trick is you can actually hold Alt on your computer, and if you click and drag on the left here, you will change your pitch by 12 semitones, which is 1 octave. So again, if you were to hold Alt and click either up or down, you can move your oscillator either up or down an octave, which is very nice to know. If I were to turn on all three of my oscillators and have each of them down 1 an octave and 2 octaves, respectively, then I have this sound. Also, every oscillator has a filter knob. Since we haven't gotten into filters yet, we don't quite know what this means, so for now we'll just kind of gloss over that. Also, every oscillator next to your wave table by default says spectrum. From my impression, this determines how your wave table is sort of bended or warped, where spectrum is just your default. But then you also have these options of bend plus, or bend minus and plus, bend minus, and formant, which are just different ways to alter your current oscillator. So you can play around with these to get even more sounds than you already have. So that's pretty much it for oscillators. Let's move on down here to modulation oscillator. Currently it's off, as you can tell, remember, because of the gray dot. If I were to turn it on, you'll notice it also has the ability to alter your pitch the same exact way we did here. You'll notice that there's a knob that says RM, and that stands for ring mod, because if you look over here on the right, we have ring mod currently selected. Now if you look at this table, these are different modes that we can, modulate our oscillators, and you can set each of these modes to different oscillators. So currently we're on ring mod. If I wanted to go to phase, for example, all I have to do is click phase. Same for position, filter. And so what you can do is with these, let's say I use phase, for example, currently they are all turned off, as you can see. I can select one oscillator that I want to apply this phase modulation to. So let's say, for example, I wanted to apply a phase modulation to oscillator 1. All I did was click oscillator 1. Now it went from off to on 1 specifically. Now I can change my phase knob by clicking and dragging up or down, and this determines how much phase I'm applying to oscillator 1. So if I were to play my sound and just sort of drag this knob up, you can notice a difference. And of course I can apply it to different oscillators too. So if I wanted to apply it to oscillator 3, for example, and of course you can add different combinations of effects. So if I wanted to add a ring mod to oscillator 1 and then change the ring mod by, clicking and dragging this up and down. Let's say I like it here, for example. And then I can also change the position, let's say on oscillator 2, for example. And so you can play around with these knobs this way to add different effects to your oscillators. And again, you can alter the pitch of your modulation if you want. And that's that. Here in the bottom left, we have noise. This is a way to add white noise to your sounds. Now, maybe not necessarily white noise. White noise is actually the default. When I say white noise, I more or less just mean staticky effects, filler, frequencies, stuff like that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be white noise. You can click this drop-down menu and actually pick the type of noise that you want. So for example, if you want a water pipes noise. You can click that. Color more or less determines the intensity. So the farthest right means it's at 100%. Farthest left means it's at 0. Anywhere in between is, you know, anywhere in between. And your amp determines the volume. So let's hear this in action. So this can be nice if you want to add some space in your sounds in different frequency ranges. So maybe in the higher frequencies you want to fill it up with white noise, for example. You can add just a smidge, maybe not too much, but just a small amount of white noise. And you can play around with these knobs, of course, as always. Next to that we have feedback, which you might have already guessed if you know what feedback means. It basically determines how much of the sound going out comes back in to be used similar to an oscillator, you know, to generate more sounds. You can turn it on, change the amplitude, which, as we already know, means volume or percentage of effectiveness, I guess, in this case. Up here in the top middle, we have our filters. As you can see, we have two filters, which are both currently on, but we have nothing selected. You can click the drop-down menu that says None and pick your type of filter. Now, I'm not going to go into what each of these filters mean necessarily, because learning about low-pass and high-pass filters is a completely separate lesson in music production altogether. So if you don't know what these mean, I recommend you look them up. They're really nice to know, but essentially you can add filters to your oscillators, which can more or less cut off certain frequencies. If I were to pick a low-pass filter, for example, if you know what a low-pass filter is, you'll know that the cutoff frequency basically means I'm taking a certain frequency and I want to cut off anything below that. Now you'll notice that in my frequency window I have 3 knobs, and currently one of them says NA. This is because these 3 knobs actually change depending on which filter you select. For example, if I were to choose a band reject filter, you'll notice that I now have 3 knobs that are all doing something now. So just keep an eye out that these knobs can actually change depending on your filter. Now, this slider on the right determines the percentage of sounds that go through this filter, where at the very highest is 100%, meaning all the sounds that go into the filter and are being applied go out, and the very bottom means 0%, so no sounds will be able to come out, assuming that this is the only filter you're being routed to, where in this case, you can see we only have 1 filter, so yeah, if I were to play my sound, nothing, just silence. Now I can also apply a separate filter. Let's say I also wanted to apply a high-pass filter, for example, and then I can change my cutoff and resonance knobs, and I can also up the volume from that guy too. Now if we go back to our oscillators, there are these sliders that I skipped over at the very beginning. I mentioned I would come back to, and here we are. They say F1 and F2 at the top and bottom respectively. This determines what filter your current oscillator is being routed to, where the very highest means your oscillator is only going through filter 1. Filter 1 is only being applied to that oscillator. And the bottom, of course, is the same, but for filter 2. Now you can go to the middle, you can double-click these, and you can double-click most knobs to set them to their default positions. The middle means that it is being routed to both filters equally. And of course, anywhere in between, so like a little bit towards 1 but not 2, means it's mostly being routed to filter 1, but also a small amount of filter 2 is being applied. So that's what these sliders mean, and what they do. Now over here on the right, you have your main amp, which says amp mod, and below it you'll see it says a number 4 by default. This means that envelope number 4 is actually being routed to our amp. We'll get into what that means in a little bit. You also have this knob that says pan. Now this determines our stereo sound, where right now it's right down the middle, which is normally the default, but you can also click and drag it down, go all the way to the left, which means our sound is only coming out of our left ear. And all the way on the right means it's only going to come out of the right ear. And of course, double clicking reverts it back to its default down the middle, which means we now have an equal sound down both ears. We also have our master knob, which determines our overall volume. This determines the volume of the final sound that we make. Click and drag it, of course, like always, up and down to change our volume. Below that, we have some effects. As you can see, both effects are currently on, according to this blue dot, but again, we have nothing selected. You can click this drop-down menu and choose from a list of effects. Now, I'm not here to teach you what each of these effects do. A lot of them are fairly straightforward, for example, reverb, but you can click and drag, but you can apply a couple of types of effects and play around with them to get the sound that you want. Now also to the right of these effects, there's also an EQ tab, which is currently turned off. You can turn it on, where you can EQ your sound here in Massive by changing your lows and highs, boosting some sounds, and also changing frequencies. You can move these knobs to your liking, play around with it, figure it out for yourself. Down here we have some inserts, which are currently off, and we have nothing selected. If we were to turn them on, we can add different types of effects to our sound. For example, a bit crusher, which sort of adds like an 8-bit effect. And you can play around with these knobs, of course, as is usually the tradition. Now we get into this big main window, which is sort of the miscellaneous tab. This is where you can do a lot of things. You'll notice there are a few tabs here. Let's go to Oscillator first. We can do a few things here. First, on the left, we can determine if we want glide in our sound, which only applies if your sound is monophonic, which we can turn on later. I'll teach you how to do that. Basically determines how smoothly your sounds transition from one note to another when played right after each other. You can also change your oscillator phases here by clicking Restart via Gate and clicking and dragging each oscillator, where these are in degrees, so 0 to 360 degrees, I believe determines the starting point of your oscillators, so you can play around with that. You can also add some vibrato to your sound by altering the depth, which is more or less the effectiveness or the amount of your vibrato, and the rate, which determines how quickly it vibrates. We also have a KTR oscillator and a KTR FLT tab, and if I'm being completely honest, I don't necessarily know what these do. All I know is that these are for the oscillator and filter, respectively, and it's a way to map certain notes to certain frequencies or something like that, and you can do the same for your filter. I would recommend looking that up and learning that from someone else, because I'm not necessarily strong on that subject. But moving on, we have our voicing tab, which determines the amount of voices that our sound makes. By default, we only have one voice, which means we only have one instance of everything we've made playing at the same time. You can have a maximum of 16, and you can change this by changing this unisona from 1, and you can click and drag all the way up to 16. So for example, my sound with one voice versus with 4, for example. Overall makes everything sound a little bit wider. From here you can change your sound from polyphonic, which allows you to play multiple notes on top of each other, which is good for chords, of course. You can either change it to monophone or monorotate, which both only allow one note to be playing at a time, which is naturally bad for chords, but a little bit better for a melody, for example. And down here you can change your trigger, which determines if your sound starts from the very beginning every time, or only if a new note is played and no new notes are played on top of it, that kind of thing. You can change your unisona spread 3 different ways by altering your pitch cutoff, wavetable position, or your pan position. Your pitch cutoff, you have a slider that starts on the left and goes to the right, where you can change your ranges over here. So let's say, for example, if I were to click and drag this to -6, all I'm saying is that this slider at the very left means it'll be at -6, and then I can do the same on the right, bump it up to whatever value I want. For now I'm going to keep it at its default of 0 and 1, which for now means the very left means I'm at 0 semitones of, pitch, and then at the very far right I'd be at 1. And this determines the variation between your voices. It's currently off, but if I were to turn it on and move this pitch cutoff just a little bit and play my sound, you should notice a difference. You can do the exact same for the wavetable position by changing these values over here and to the right, turning it on and moving the knob. You can also do the same for the pan position, where the very far left turns your sound into full inverse, the very far right is full, and the middle is mono. And this is another way to add a nice full feeling to your sound. It makes it feel a little bit wider. Or if you'd prefer it, you can also change it to mono. Next to our voicing tab, we also have a routing tab, which is a little complex, and we're already running a little long on time, so I'd rather not spend too much time explaining what this is all about. But basically you can click and select different things and determine at what point they are in effect. So it's a way of saying, oh, I don't know, I want this insert, for example, to occur before my filters. So I would do this, as a particular example. Or, oh, I want some feedback to occur right after my inserts, but also before my effects, and that kind of thing. To the right of that, we have our global tab, which is a good way to change your settings for your sound. I'd recommend looking into all these settings and change them to get the sound that you like. Now, right below these tabs that we just covered, we have 8 blue and green envelopes and LFOs. Now, these are a great way to alter your sound. You can go into any of these. If I were to pick envelope 4, for example, and I pick envelope 4 because, remember, our amp mod, uses 4. What you see here is the envelope of our sound. If you don't know what that means, it essentially think of this as a graph of volume over time. Naturally, there are no units or anything, so it's not anything too precise, but then again, that's not really what an envelope is anyways. It's just one way you could think of it. You can change this envelope setting by changing these knobs down here. So for example, if I were to add some attack to my sound, that's a way of saying it's going to reach max volume in a really long amount of time. If, in case you're not already familiar with what attack is, it's a way of saying I want to make the sound fade in. So if I were to have this much attack and play my sound now, you'll notice it kind of fades in. So naturally, the shorter the attack, the quicker the sound comes into play. The longer the attack, the longer it comes in. Right next to it, we have a level, which determines the volume the attack comes into. So if I were to lower this down to middle, for example, it means that once this attack period is done, the sound is only at about half volume, and then based on the rest of our envelope, eventually it gets louder, as you can see. So that's what this level does. It more or less determines the height of this leftmost dotted line. This decay determines how long the sound is on for. So a lower decay means the sound is only activated for a short period amount of time, and then the rest of the envelope occurs. A long decay means it is active for a long amount of time. The level next to here determines the height of this rightmost dotted line, as opposed to this level, which is the leftmost dotted line. This S-loop, morph, and level over here, this section, only comes into play if you add in some wonky effects and stuff, which I won't really get into right now, but that's what they do. Your release determines the fade out portion of your sound. So a longer release means it'll take longer to fade out once the note is done playing, and a short release essentially means once the sound is done playing, it will just stop immediately. And you can change each of these 4 envelopes by repeating that same process. Now, one thing that's cool about envelopes, and as we'll learn LFOs as well, is you can click and drag on these arrows right here, and then drag them into any of these open boxes. You'll notice that there are these boxes in a bunch of places. So what I can do is I can click and drag this into any box that I want. Now, what this allows me to do is I can either click up or down on this 4 that I just added in, and you'll notice that this blue circle kind of orbits around that knob. Basically what this is saying is if I were to do it this way, I'm saying that I want this wavetable position, this knob in theory, to move all the way up to whatever position I determine. So maybe I want it to only go up to here, where this is the max. I want it to say, I want this wavetable position to be altered by this envelope. Remember how I painted the picture? You could think of this as a graph of volume over time. In this case, let's think of this as percentage over time. So in this case, my envelope 4, over a decent amount of time, it eventually reaches full percent, stays at 100%, and eventually decreases. If I map that to my wavetable position, that's what will happen, is over a short period of time, it'll eventually reach this max that I told it to, and then stay there for a while, and then lower. And I can do that with any of these envelopes, and I can add that to any of these open squares. So if I were to add an envelope to this pitch and, up it by 12 semitones, for example, I'm saying 12 semitones is the max, and I want it to be altered to the shape of this envelope. If you look at envelope 1, over a short period of time, it eventually reaches 100%, slowly decreases, and then kind of fades out. So that's a way of saying I want it to slowly go up to 12 semitones, and it'll go through every sound in between, and then slowly decrease. So if I were to play my sound, it certainly doesn't sound good, but that's what's happening. Now, if I've added in one of these envelopes into these squares and I don't necessarily want it here anymore, I can right-click, I can either mute it or I can turn it off, and that just removes that automation. Finally, one last thing we can learn about is these LFOs. We have 4 LFOs and they all do the same thing. It's just a way of saying you can have up to 4 and you can map them all wherever you'd like. LFOs essentially generate a consistent pattern. If you were to look here, the preset is a sine wave. You can change your curves by going here where it says curve select, and you can pick from the defaults. You have your sine, I believe this one's called a sawtooth, your square, and your triangle. Or you can click this drop down menu and pick some interesting effects that they have generated. And this determines the shape that your sound that this LFO will take. You can think of this similarly to the envelope as, you know, percentage over time sort of thing, where if you'll notice it actually goes up to, if we consider this 100%, then it can also go down to negative 100%. And you can actually change this time by changing this rate, where the bottom left is very, very slow and the far right is very, very fast. If you don't want this rate knob, which is rather precise, you can change it to sync and change this ratio to whatever you'd want. So this determines the speed of your LFO. This amp determines the percentage of effectiveness, as we've learned. So far left means 0%, far right means 100%. You'll notice we can also have two curves, which we can fade between, which I believe is a way of balancing your two waves. You can also click and drag on your waves and move them to wherever you'd like. So in theory, I could turn this sine wave into a cosine just by doing that, which shifts it by 180 degrees. And again, I can click and drag this onto any of these open squares. So for example, if I drag it onto my intensity, and if I were to lower my intensity, I can click up on this 5, and you'll notice that I now have a light green and a bright green half circle from what I just made around my intensity knob. And this determines, like I said, your LFO goes up to 100% and down to negative 100%. It's just a way of saying that however much it goes up, it also goes down the same amount. So if I were to mute my oscillators actually, and turn off these, and just add this LFO to, I don't know, my pitch, for example, if I set it to 12 semitones, that means to the ratio of 1/16, which I determined, that's relatively fast, then my pitch will shift either up 12 semitones and then back down 12 semitones to this, you know, curve that I created. So it sounds like this. And that's just one particular specific sound that I created. You could easily create your own unique sounds by, you know, changing these curves. Maybe you only want one curve, changing this position, changing the different types, changing your ratio, which is your speed, stuff like that. And that pretty much does it. There are some things that I didn't cover, like different views, for example, attribute views or the browser view. I didn't necessarily teach you how to control your macro knobs. So that'll do it. That's more or less how to navigate Massive's interface, and that's pretty much the basics on how to use it. I know this was relatively long, but you guys know that I love to be thorough, so hopefully that paid off. Hopefully that was nice as opposed to being a bad thing. I appreciate you watching. Hope you learned a thing or two. As always, I will see you in the next one. Bye.